What if everything you believed about America's destiny was about to be challenged? What if a vision from beyond revealed a future so unexpected, so controversial, that it would shake the very foundation of faith communities across the nation? In 1987, a woman named Sarah Mitchell experienced something that would haunt her for decades. During a near-death experience following a severe car accident, she claims she was shown visions of America's future. Visions that contradict some of the most deeply held beliefs in Christian prophecy. And here's what makes this story so unsettling. Many of the things she saw decades ago are beginning to unfold right before our eyes. This isn't about politics. This isn't about taking sides. This is about confronting a vision that challenges our assumptions about divine will, national destiny, and the path we're walking as a society. Whether you believe in heavenly visions or not, what Sarah saw and what's happening now will make you question everything you thought you knew about where we're headed. The vision that changed everything. Sarah Mitchell was a devout Christian, a Sunday school teacher, a woman who had dedicated her life to her faith. On that autumn evening in 1987, as her car spun out of control on a rain-slicked highway, she never imagined her entire worldview was about to be transformed. Clinical death lasted 4 minutes. But in those 4 minutes, Sarah claims she experienced something beyond comprehension. She described being pulled upward, surrounded by an overwhelming light that felt both terrifying and peaceful. And then she says, she was shown images, scenes playing out like a film of America's future, but these weren't the triumphant visions of revival and return to traditional values that she expected. Instead, what she saw left her confused, even disturbed. She saw a nation transforming in ways that contradicted everything her church had taught her about the end times and America's role in God's plan. When Sarah tried to share her experience with her church community, she was met with resistance, even hostility. How could a vision from heaven contradict their understanding of Scripture? How could God show her something that seemed to go against their prophecies? The tension became so intense that Sarah eventually stopped speaking about it publicly, until recently. The first prophecy, a changing moral landscape. In her vision, Sarah saw American society embracing diversity and acceptance in ways that would make traditional believers uncomfortable. She saw laws changing, social norms evolving, and what surprised her most was the sense of peace that accompanied these changes in her vision. This wasn't the chaos and destruction that end times prophecies predicted. Instead, she witnessed a society learning to coexist with differences, even thriving because of them. Sarah describes seeing children of different backgrounds learning together, celebrating their differences rather than hiding them. She saw families that looked nothing like the traditional nuclear family being accepted, loved, and integrated into communities. And what troubled her most at the time was that in this vision, this wasn't presented as society's downfall, but as its evolution towards something resembling the core teaching she had always believed in: love thy neighbor. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could a vision from the divine realm show her a future that her church leaders said would bring judgment and destruction? How could acceptance and inclusion be part of God's plan when she had been taught they were signs of moral decay? These questions would haunt Sarah for years, forcing her to re-examine everything she thought she understood about faith and prophecy. The second prophecy. The fracturing of religious power. Sarah saw something even more controversial. She witnessed the traditional power structures of organized religion beginning to crumble. But this wasn't the persecution that had been prophesied. Instead, she saw people walking away from institutions while deepening their spiritual connections. She saw empty megachurches and filled community centers. She saw the rise of individual spiritual journeys that didn't fit into denominational boxes. In her vision, this shift wasn't accompanied by divine punishment. Instead, there was a sense of return to something more authentic, more personal. She saw people helping each other not because a church organized it, but because compassion became a natural expression of their spiritual understanding. The middlemen of faith were disappearing, and direct connection was taking their place. This vision particularly troubled religious leaders when Sarah first shared it. The idea that institutional religion might lose its grip wasn't framed as judgment against the faithful, but as a necessary evolution. It suggested that perhaps the structures built around faith had become more important than the faith itself, and for those whose identity and livelihood depended on these structures, this vision felt like an attack. The third prophecy: science and spirituality. Merge, one of the most unexpected elements of Sarah's vision, was watching science and spirituality stop being adversaries and start becoming allies. She saw laboratories and meditation centers existing side by side. She witnessed breakthroughs in consciousness research that validated spiritual experiences while explaining them through new scientific frameworks. The old war between faith and reason was ending not through the victory of one over the other, but through their integration. Sarah describes seeing technologies that could measure and even induce spiritual experiences, making what was once considered exclusively supernatural accessible and understandable. She saw this leading not to the death of spirituality, but to its democratization. No longer would divine experiences be the sole domain of the religiously devout. Anyone, regardless of belief system, could access these profound states of consciousness. For traditional believers, this vision represents perhaps the ultimate heresy. The idea that transcendent experiences aren't exclusive to their faith, that heaven or divine consciousness might be a state rather than a place, and that science might provide keys to unlock what religion had kept behind locked doors. Yet in Sarah's vision, this wasn't the end of the sacred, it was its beginning for millions who had been excluded. The fourth prophecy: environmental awakening. Sarah saw Americans experiencing a massive shift in consciousness regarding the earth itself. She witnessed communities coming together not around religious revival, but around environmental restoration. She saw young people leading movements that treated the planet as sacred, using language that sounded more spiritual than political. Nature wasn't just being protected, it was being revered. In her vision, this environmental awakening had a spiritual quality that transcended traditional religious frameworks. People spoke of the earth as a living system, of humanity's role as steward rather than master. And what struck Sarah most was how this movement incorporated indigenous wisdom that Christianity had long dismissed or destroyed. The future she saw acknowledged that perhaps other cultures had understood our relationship with creation better all along. This vision challenges the dominance theology that many Christians embrace. The idea that humans have been given the earth to exploit as we see fit. Instead, Sarah saw a future where such thinking was recognized as the hubris that led to climate catastrophe, and where healing the planet became a sacred calling that united rather than divided people. The fifth prophecy: the rise of feminine power. Perhaps no aspect of Sarah's vision was more controversial than what she saw regarding gender and power. She witnessed women rising to positions of influence not by becoming like men, but by bringing distinctly feminine approaches to leadership. She saw masculine and feminine energies finally finding balance after millennia of imbalance. And she saw this shift happening not through conflict, but through a collective recognition that patriarchal structures had run their course. In her vision, the traditional family structure wasn't destroyed, but it was joined by countless other valid ways of organizing human relationships and raising children. She saw men finding freedom in this shift too, liberated from the crushing weight of toxic masculinity and able to express their full emotional range. The rigid gender roles that churches had insisted were divinely ordained were revealed as cultural constructs that no longer served humanity's evolution. For Christian communities that base much of their theology on male headship and female submission, this vision represents a fundamental challenge to their understanding of God's order. Yet Sarah insists that in her experience, this rebalancing felt divinely inspired, as if creation was finally exhaling after holding its breath for thousands of years. The sixth prophecy. Economic transformation. Sarah saw an American economy that looked radically different from both capitalism and socialism as we understand them. She witnessed the rise of cooperative models, of communities creating their own currencies, of the gap between rich and poor finally being addressed not through government mandate, but through collective awakening to our interdependence. Greed wasn't legislated away, it simply became recognized as the sickness it is. In this vision, the prosperity gospel that had taken over much of American Christianity was exposed as one of the greatest deceptions ever sold to believers. She saw people understanding that the accumulation of wealth wasn't a sign of divine favor, and that poverty wasn't a punishment for lack of faith. Instead, she witnessed a return to the communal living described in the book of Acts, where believers shared everything and made sure no one had need. This economic vision terrifies those who have built empires while preaching the gospel. It suggests that the merger of Christianity with capitalism was never divinely ordained, but was instead a corruption of the message, and it implies that the future belongs not to those who accumulated the most, but to those who learned to share freely. The seventh prophecy. Truth becomes visible. One of the most powerful aspects of Sarah's vision was seeing a time when deception became increasingly difficult to maintain. She describes a future where technology made lies transparent, where leaders couldn't hide their true motives, where institutions couldn't cover up their corruption. This wasn't Big Brother surveillance, it was collective discernment reaching a critical mass. She saw scandals erupting across religious institutions as truths that had been buried for generations came to light. She witnessed the exposure of leaders who had used faith as a cover for exploitation, of organizations that had prioritized power over people, of systems that had claimed to speak for God while serving themselves. And while this revelation was painful, it was also liberating, clearing the way for something more authentic to emerge. For many believers, this is perhaps the most frightening prophecy of all, because it means that the institutions they've trusted, the leaders they've followed, the systems they've defended, might all be revealed as deeply flawed. It requires a willingness to admit that we've been deceived, that our faith might have been manipulated, that the structures we thought were sacred might actually be obstacles to the divine. The eighth prophecy, unity. Through crisis, Sarah's vision showed Americans facing unprecedented challenges, crises that would force us to choose between continuing our divisions or finally recognizing our common humanity. She saw natural disasters, economic collapses, and social upheavals that made partisan politics seem absurdly trivial. And in the crucible of these trials, she witnessed something remarkable: communities coming together across all the lines that had previously divided them. In her vision, this unity didn't come from religious revival in the traditional sense. It came from people recognizing that survival and thriving required cooperation, that our old tribal identities were luxuries we could no longer afford. She saw Christian and Muslim working side by side to rebuild communities. She saw liberal and conservative finding common ground in practical problems that needed solving. She saw the artificial boundaries dissolving in the face of real challenges. This prophecy suggests that the future won't belong to whichever ideology wins the culture war, but to those willing to transcend ideology altogether. It implies that God's plan might not be about one group defeating all the others, but about all of us finally learning to work together. For those invested in being right and proving others wrong, this vision offers no comfort. The ninth prophecy, children leading the way. Perhaps the most hopeful element of Sarah's vision was seeing the role of young people in shaping America's future. She witnessed a generation that refused to accept the divisions, the prejudices, and the limitations that previous generations had normalized. These children and young adults had a moral clarity that shamed their elders, calling out hypocrisy wherever they found it, including and especially in religious institutions. In her vision, these young people weren't rebelling against faith itself, but against the corrupted versions of faith they'd inherited. They were asking questions that made adults uncomfortable. Why does the church spend millions on buildings while people are homeless? How can we claim to follow Jesus while ignoring the poor? Why do we preach love while practicing exclusion? And their questions were forcing a reckoning that couldn't be avoided. Sarah saw these young people creating new forms of community, new expressions of spirituality, new ways of organizing society that honored both individual freedom and collective responsibility. They weren't waiting for permission from the old guard. They were simply building the world they wanted to see, and in doing so, making the old systems increasingly irrelevant. The uncomfortable truth. Here's what makes Sarah's vision so controversial. It doesn't fit the narrative that most American Christians have been taught to expect. There's no rapture rescuing believers from tribulation. There's no Antichrist establishing a one-world government. There's no final battle between good and evil with clear sides and a predetermined winner. Instead, there's evolution, adaptation, transformation, and a future that belongs to those willing to grow rather than those insisting on being right. If Sarah's vision is true, or even partially true, it means that much of what's been preached as biblical prophecy might actually be cultural preference dressed up as divine revelation. It means that the future might not reward those who held most tightly to tradition, but those who remained open to truth wherever it appeared. It means that God's plan might be far more inclusive, surprising, and challenging than we've been led to believe. And perhaps most uncomfortably, it suggests that many of the changes that conservative Christians have been fighting against might not be signs of society's moral decay, but of its evolution towards something that actually embodies the love, acceptance, and unity that Jesus taught. It raises the possibility that we've been on the wrong side, fighting against the very transformation that the divine has been trying to bring about. The question we must ask: so what do we do with a vision like this? How do we respond to a prophecy that contradicts our expectations? We can dismiss it entirely, write Sarah off as deluded or deceived. We can get angry, seeing it as an attack on our faith and our values. Or we can sit with the discomfort, allowing ourselves to question whether what we've been taught is the whole truth. Maybe the real test of faith isn't blind adherence to doctrine, but the courage to remain open to truth even when it challenges everything we thought we knew. Maybe God is bigger than our theologies, more surprising than our prophecies, more inclusive than our exclusive claims to truth. Maybe the future belongs not to those who were certain they had all the answers, but to those humble enough to admit they might have been wrong. Sarah Mitchell's vision won't be popular in most Christian circles. It will be condemned, criticized, and dismissed. But that's exactly what happened to prophets throughout history, who dared to challenge the religious establishment of their time. The question isn't whether her vision makes us comfortable. The question is whether we're brave enough to consider that it might be true. What future are you building? Are you holding on to a version of America and Christianity that might be crumbling not because of attack from outside, but because it was never meant to last? Or are you open to a transformation that might look nothing like you expected, but might actually bring us closer to the love, justice, and unity that the divine has always been calling us toward? The choice is ours. The future is unfolding, and the visions we choose to believe will shape the world we create. Sarah saw something that challenged her faith, and in doing so, deepened it in ways she never expected. Perhaps that's the real message, that true faith isn't about certainty, but about remaining open to truth wherever it leads, even when it leads us far from where we thought we'd go. If this vision troubles you, good. Sit with that discomfort. Ask yourself why. What is being threatened? Your faith or your certainty? Your relationship with the divine or your comfortable interpretation of what that relationship should look like? The answers might surprise you. They might even transform you. And if you found this exploration challenging and thought-provoking, let me know in the comments what parts resonated with you or what you disagreed with. Subscribe for more content that pushes us to think deeper and question our assumptions. Hit that like button if you appreciate content that doesn't shy away from uncomfortable conversations. Because the future belongs to those brave enough to face it honestly, not those hiding behind the certainty of yesterday's beliefs.